In the autumn of 1885, in a small stone convent on the edge of a forgotten European valley, a dying nun made a confession that her superiors quietly buried for more than a century. She had spent the final 2 years of her life teaching Latin to a child. But the child was not an ordinary child. The child was almost 7 feet tall at the age of 9. The child had grey eyes that did not blink the way other children blinked. And the child, according to the nun's own written words, did not learn the Latin she was being taught. The child remembered it. Every declension, every irregular verb, every classical phrase the sister set before her. The girl would pause, tilt her head, and recite the answer before the sister had finished writing the question. And one evening, near the end, the sister asked the child a question in a language no living human was supposed to understand. The child answered, calmly, correctly, in the same tongue. The convent records describing the girl were sealed. The sister's journal was hidden inside the spine of a hymn book. The child was removed by people who arrived in a black carriage with no markings, and she was never seen in that valley again. And what the nun wrote in her final days, what she swore on her rosary before she died, has only recently begun to surface in the margins of forgotten church archives. Tonight, we are going to read what she wrote. We are going to walk through the convent. We are going to meet the giant child. And we are going to ask the question the sister herself asked on her deathbed, the question the church refused to answer. If you find these forgotten stories as strange and as important as I do, please take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel and to leave a like on this video. It helps these hidden histories reach the people who are still looking for them, and it tells the algorithm that there are still those of us who want to know what was buried. Thank you, sincerely, for being here tonight. Now, let us begin. The convent sat in a narrow valley in what was then the eastern reach of the Austrian Crown lands, though the people of the valley used older names for the country and older names for the mountains around it. The building was small, grey stone, a single bell tower, a walled garden. Behind the convent, a forest climbed into the foothills. In front of it, a road ran down to a village of perhaps 200 souls. The sisters numbered 11. Their order was old, older than the records of the diocese that supposedly oversaw them. The valley itself had a strange reputation. The locals would not walk certain paths after dark. They left small offerings of bread and salt at the base of certain trees. They told their children not to look at the old foundations in the woods behind the convent, the foundations of something much larger that no one in living memory had ever seen standing. The sisters tended the chapel. They prayed the hours. They cared for the sick. They took in orphans when orphans appeared. And in the spring of 1883, an orphan appeared at their gate who would change everything. She arrived without explanation. There was no letter. There was no priest accompanying her. There was no carriage. She simply stood at the wooden gate one morning, barefoot, wrapped in a coarse grey cloak, and she waited. The sister who first saw her, a young sister named Clara, would later write that the child did not knock. She did not call out. She simply stood there, perfectly still, as if she had been standing there for hours, and her eyes were on the door of the chapel rather than the door of the convent. Sister Clara opened the gate. She asked the child her name. The child answered in clear, careful German with an accent that Clara could not place. She gave a single name. We will use, as the sister who taught her later used, the name Anya. Anya did not say where she had come from. She did not say who had brought her. She said only that she had been told to come to this place and that the sisters would know her when they saw her. The child was perhaps 8 years old by appearance, though her height was already extraordinary. She stood nearly as tall as Sister Clara herself. Her hair was almost black, falling straight past her shoulders. Her skin was very pale. Her hands were long and slender. And her eyes, Clara wrote later, were grey, a pale, even, almost silver grey, like the colour of wet stone in winter light. Clara brought the child inside. The Mother Superior was summoned. The Mother Superior was an old woman named Sister Margaretha. She had been at the convent for 50 years. She had seen many strange things in her time, but when she saw the child standing in the small front hall of the convent, she stopped in the doorway and did not move for a long moment. Then she crossed herself. Then she walked forward, knelt down so that her eyes were level with the child's eyes, and she asked, in a voice that the other sisters had never heard her use before, whether the child had come from the old house. The child nodded. Sister Margaretha closed her eyes. She remained kneeling for what Clara remembered as a very long time. Then she stood up, told Clara to take the child to the empty cell at the end of the eastern corridor, to feed her, to bathe her, and to bring her clean clothes. And she told Clara that the child was not to be discussed with any visitor, any priest, any official from the diocese, or any traveller who might pass through. The child was to be treated as a daughter of the convent, nothing more, nothing less. Clara obeyed. She took the child to the cell. She brought water, she brought bread, and warm milk. She brought a simple grey dress and a wool shawl, and as she helped the child change out of the coarse cloak, she saw something that she described in her journal only in a single line. The child's back, she wrote, bore markings she did not understand, faint silver lines that traced patterns she had never seen on any human skin, patterns that seemed to move very slightly when the child breathed. Clara did not write any more about the markings. She prayed, and she did not speak of what she had seen. The child remained in the convent. For the first few months, Anya was kept apart from the daily life of the convent. She slept in the small cell at the end of the eastern corridor. She ate her meals alone, brought to her on a wooden tray. She did not attend the chapel services. She did not walk in the garden when the other sisters were there. When she went outside, which was usually in the very early morning before the sun had cleared the ridge, she went alone, and she walked the inside of the convent wall slowly, her long pale hand trailing against the stone. She did not speak much. When she did speak, she spoke quietly, in that same careful German with the placeless accent, and she answered every question put to her with a precision that the sisters found unsettling. If she was asked something she did not wish to answer, she would simply remain silent, her grey eyes resting on the questioner, until the questioner moved on. She grew. That was the first thing the sisters noticed in the autumn of 1883. The child grew at a rate that the sisters at first refused to acknowledge. In the spring she had been as tall as Sister Clara. By the end of summer she was taller. By the end of autumn she was the tallest person in the convent. She was not yet 10 years old, and she stood close to 6.5 feet. Her hands and feet had grown in proportion. Her face, however, remained the face of a child, not a young woman, not a tall adolescent, a child. The eyes of a child, though grey and steady, the mouth of a child, the smooth, unlined brow of a child. It was as though her body was racing ahead of her years, while her face stayed exactly where it had begun. The sisters whispered. The sisters prayed. The Mother Superior gathered them in the chapter house one evening and told them, very calmly, that the child was a gift from God, that her shape and her size were not their concern, that her soul was their concern, and that no sister was to write any letter or to speak any word about her to anyone outside the convent walls. 2 sisters protested. The Mother Superior heard them out, thanked them, and then told them, in the same calm voice, that if either of them sent a word outside the walls, they would be removed from the order. They were not removed. They obeyed, and the child continued to grow. By the spring of 1884, when Anya was perhaps 9 years old by appearance, the Mother Superior made a decision. The child needed to be educated. The child needed to be given the discipline of letters, of grammar, of scripture, of the old languages of the Church. The Mother Superior chose a sister to be her teacher. She did not choose Clara. Clara was young, and Clara had seen the markings on the child's back. The Mother Superior chose instead the oldest of the sisters apart from herself, a woman in her late 70s, a woman who had entered the order at 14 and had never left, Sister Theresia. Sister Theresia was small, thin, bent slightly forward at the shoulders from a lifetime of bending over books and over the sick. Her hair, what little of it showed beneath her wimple, was white. Her eyes were pale blue and very clear. She had been the convent's teacher of letters for 40 years, instructing the orphan girls who passed through the convent walls in reading, in writing, in the catechism, and in the rudiments of Latin. She had taught more than 100 girls. She knew how children learned. She knew how they failed. She knew the moment in a lesson when a child grasped something for the first time, and she knew the moment when a child was merely repeating without understanding. And she had been told by the Mother Superior, in a private conversation in the chapter house, that the child she was about to teach was unusual, and that she was to teach her as one would teach any other orphan, and that she was to bring everything she observed to the Mother Superior alone, and not to write any of it down. Sister Teresa agreed. That same night she opened a small leather journal she had abandoned for many years, and she began to write. She wrote because she did not trust her memory. She wrote because she felt, even before her first lesson with the child, that something was being given to her that she could not bear alone. The first lesson took place on a quiet grey morning in April of 1884. Sister Teresa entered the small cell at the end of the eastern corridor carrying a wooden tray on which lay a single slate, a piece of chalk, a small book of Latin grammar, and a copy of the Vulgate. The child was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, fully dressed, her hands folded in her lap, her grey eyes on the door. She had clearly been waiting. Sister Teresa greeted her in German. The child returned the greeting. Sister Teresa sat down on the small wooden stool that had been placed in the cell. She set the tray on the bed beside the child. She opened the grammar to its first page. She pointed to the first declension, and she began, gently, slowly, as she had begun 100 times before with 100 different girls, to explain the idea of a noun, the idea of a case, the idea of inflection. She did not finish. The child interrupted her. The child said, quietly, and without any rudeness, that she already knew this. Sister Teresa paused. She set down the chalk. She looked at the child. She asked, in the most neutral voice she could manage, whether the child had been taught Latin before. The child shook her head. Sister Teresa asked then how the child could know what she had just said she knew. The child looked at her with those grey, level eyes, and the child said only that the words were familiar, that the patterns were familiar, that when Sister Teresa spoke a Latin word aloud, something inside her recognized it, the way one recognizes the face of a relative one has not seen in many years. Sister Teresa thought for a moment. She picked up the chalk again. She wrote a Latin sentence on the slate. The child translated it correctly. Sister Teresa wrote another sentence, more difficult. The child translated it. Sister Teresa wrote a third sentence, a piece of Cicero that she had memorized in her own girlhood. The child translated it. And then the child, in her quiet, careful German, completed the next sentence of the passage. A sentence Sister Teresa had not written down. A sentence Sister Teresa had also memorized, decades ago. The child knew the passage. The child knew what came next. Sister Teresa closed the book. She sat very still. She told the child, in a steady voice, that the lesson was finished for the day. She gathered the tray. She left the cell. She walked down the eastern corridor, past the chapel, past the chapter house, into her own cell, and she closed the door. And then she sat down at her small writing desk, opened her leather journal, and she wrote a single sentence at the top of a fresh page. The sentence read, in her careful old-fashioned hand, that the child does not learn, the child remembers, and may God forgive us for what we are teaching her. Sister Teresa did not stop teaching the child. She continued. She continued because she had been ordered to. She continued because she believed, in some old and stubborn part of her heart, that the right thing to do with a mystery was not to flee from it, but to sit very close to it and watch. She continued because she loved the child. That was the part she did not write down for a long time. She loved the child. Within the first month of those lessons, she had begun to love her. The child was quiet. The child was respectful. The child stood when Sister Teresa entered the cell and remained standing until Sister Teresa sat. The child folded her long hands in her lap and listened with a stillness that was almost frightening, and yet, when the lesson was over, the child would sometimes ask a small, soft question about the world outside the convent, about the village down the road, about the names of the birds, about whether the river at the bottom of the valley was wide or narrow, and in those moments she sounded like the child she appeared to be, and Sister Teresa would feel something in her chest soften, and she would answer as gently as she could. The lessons themselves became something other than lessons. Sister Theresia stopped trying to teach the child Latin grammar because the child already knew the grammar. She began instead to read the child texts. She would bring a passage from Virgil. She would read it aloud. She would ask the child what she thought. The child would answer with observations that made Sister Theresia sit back on her wooden stool and stare. The child noticed rhythms. The child noticed the way a single word echoed an older word from an older poem. The child, who had no books in her cell, who had never been to a library, spoke about Latin literature the way a man who had spent his life among it spoke. And then, in the early summer of 1884, something else began to happen. The child began to correct her, gently, always gently. Sister Theresia would read a line. The child would say, after a pause, that the word in the original was not quite that word. That the line was usually copied with a small error, an error introduced by a medieval scribe, and that the true reading, the older reading, was slightly different, and the child would give the older reading. Sister Theresia would write it down. She would compare it later, in the convent's small library, against the older editions she could find. And the child was right, every time. The child knew which lines in the books of the church had been altered by copyists. The child knew which lines had been smoothed out, sweetened, brought into line with later doctrine. The child did not say any of this in a tone of accusation. She said it the way one might mention that a window had been painted over. She said it as a fact about the world. And Sister Theresia wrote, in her journal, that she did not know whether to be terrified or to fall to her knees in gratitude. She wrote that perhaps both were appropriate. The summer passed. The child grew taller. She was now nearly 7 feet tall, and her face was still the face of a child. The sisters had begun to keep her almost entirely indoors during the daylight hours, because the gardener from the village had begun to ask questions, and because a travelling peddler had glimpsed her one evening through a gap in the wall, and had told his story in the village inn. The Mother Superior had paid the innkeeper a quiet sum to lose the story, but she knew it would not stay lost forever. In the autumn of 1884, Sister Theresia began the second phase of the lessons. She began to teach the child Greek. She did this on her own initiative, without consulting the Mother Superior, because she wanted to test something. She wanted to know whether the child's recognition extended to other languages, or whether it was limited to Latin. She brought the small Greek primer she had kept since her own girlhood. She opened it. The child read the first sentence aloud, in Greek, with what Sister Theresia later wrote was a perfect classical pronunciation, a pronunciation no living teacher used any more, a pronunciation drawn from a time before the pronunciation had drifted. Sister Theresia closed the primer. She picked up the child's hand. She held it for a long moment. She asked, quietly, whether the child had ever been to Athens. The child said no. Sister Theresia asked whether the child had ever been to Rome. The child said no. Sister Theresia asked, after a long pause, whether the child had ever been to a city of any kind. The child paused for a longer time. The child said that she had been to a city once, a long time ago, a city that no longer stood, a city whose name she could no longer remember in the languages they had together, but whose streets she could still see, and whose sky she could still see, and whose music she could still hear when she was very tired and falling asleep. That evening in her journal she wrote a longer entry. She wrote that the child was carrying something that did not belong in a child, that the child's memory reached backwards into places that were not in any history book she had ever read, that the child spoke of a city, and Sister Theresia believed her, and that this belief in itself was an act of obedience to a truth her order had perhaps known long before she was born. And she wrote that she did not know what the old house was, and that she was beginning, finally, after 63 years in the order, to think she ought to ask. She did not ask. She kept teaching. She kept reading. She kept writing. The child kept growing. The convent kept its silence. And in the winter of 1884, in the deepest darkness of the year, when the snow lay heavy on the valley and the road to the village was closed for days at a time, Sister Theresia opened a book she had not opened in many years, and she began the third phase of the lessons, the phase that would, in the end, decide everything. The book Sister Teresia opened was not a Latin book. It was not a Greek book. It was a book she had taken decades earlier from a locked cabinet in the convent's small library, a cabinet to which only the Mother Superior and the convent's teacher of letters had keys. The book was bound in dark leather, worn at the edges, and it contained handwritten copies of inscriptions and fragments that had been gathered, over centuries, by sisters of the order, from old stones and old walls in valleys across that part of the world. The language of the inscriptions was not Latin, it was not Greek, it was not any language Sister Teresia had ever heard spoken. Within the order, the elder sisters called it simply the older tongue, and it was understood, in the quiet way the convent understood many things, that the language had been the speech of the people who had built the first foundations in the forest behind the convent, the foundations of the great house that no one in living memory had seen standing. Sister Teresia had studied the older tongue, alone, for 40 years. She had pieced together a small vocabulary. She had identified roots. She had matched certain phrases against the ritual phrases the eldest sisters still spoke under their breath at certain hours of the night, phrases that had been passed down in the order without explanation, phrases that were said over the dying and over the newly born. She had not, in all her years of study, ever spoken any of those phrases aloud. The Mother Superior had said, when she gave Sister Teresia the key to the cabinet, that the older tongue was not for speaking, it was for keeping. On a snowy evening in late January of 1885, Sister Teresia sat beside Anya in the small cell at the end of the eastern corridor. The lesson had finished. The lamp on the small table was burning low. The child was tired. Her grey eyes were half closed, and Sister Teresia, after sitting in silence for a long time, leaned forward and spoke a single sentence in the older tongue. The sentence she spoke was a question. It was a question she had reconstructed from 3 different fragments over many years, and she believed, though she could not be certain, that it meant something like, "Do you remember the house in which you were born?" She spoke it quietly. She did not expect an answer. She had spoken it as one speaks a prayer, to test what her own voice would feel like saying those forbidden sounds aloud. The child opened her eyes. The child looked at her. The child sat up. And the child answered, in the same tongue, several sentences, quietly, calmly, with the placeless accent that her German also carried, but now without any hesitation, without any searching for words, the way a person answers a question in the language of her childhood. Sister Teresia did not understand all of what the child said. She understood some of it. She understood enough to write down, that night, in her journal, the words she had been able to catch. The child had said something about a house. The child had said something about a river of light. The child had said something about people who were tall, and who had gone away, and who were waiting. And then the child had said one sentence which Sister Teresia understood completely, because it used words she had pieced together over decades, and the sentence was this. The child said, "When you teach me, you are not teaching me. You are giving me back what was taken." Sister Teresia closed her journal. She blew out the lamp. She sat in the dark for a long time, and she made in that dark the decision that would end her teaching of the child, and that would in the end cost her her life. She decided that she would write everything down. Everything. The conversations, the translations, the corrections the child had made to the holy texts, the sentence in the older tongue, the reference to a house and to a river of light, and to tall people who were waiting. She would write it all in her journal, and she would hide the journal inside the spine of the convent's oldest hymn book, and she would tell no one, because she did not trust any longer that the order itself wanted this knowledge to survive. In February of 1885, the carriage came. It came at night. The sisters heard the wheels on the frozen road. They heard the horses stop outside the gate. They heard the soft knock. 2 men in dark coats entered the convent. They did not speak to anyone except the Mother Superior. They went directly to her chamber. When they came out, the Mother Superior was with them, and she went herself, alone, to the small cell at the end of the eastern corridor. She woke the child. She dressed the child in a heavy travelling cloak. She walked the child out of the convent, into the courtyard, into the carriage. The child did not cry. The child did not resist. As she passed Sister Teresa, who was standing in the corridor in her nightdress, the child stopped. She looked up at Sister Teresa with her steady grey eyes. She said one sentence. She said it in the older tongue. Sister Teresa later wrote that the sentence meant, "Thank you for remembering me with me." Then the child climbed into the carriage. The door closed. The carriage rolled away into the snow. The Mother Superior returned to her chamber and did not come out for 2 days. The sisters never saw the child again. Sister Teresa fell ill in the spring of 1885. A slow illness, a quiet one. She continued to teach the orphan girls of the convent until she could no longer rise from her bed. In her final weeks, she made her last confession. She wrote in her journal that she had told her confessor everything, and that her confessor had wept, and that her confessor had asked her, on the saints and on her soul, to allow the journal to be burned with her body. She had refused. She had hidden the journal in the spine of the hymn book before her confessor had even reached the door. She died in the autumn of 1885, with her rosary in her hand and the name of the child on her lips. The hymn book remained on the shelf in the chapel. It was used at services for decades. No one opened the spine. No one knew. In the early years of the 21st century, when the convent was finally closed and its small library was inventoried by a regional archivist, the hymn book was opened, the journal was found, the pages were read. And the questions that Sister Teresa had asked, the questions the order had buried, began very slowly to be asked again. Who was the child? Where had she come from? What was the house in the forest behind the convent? What were the markings on her back that Sister Clara had seen and never spoken of? What was the older tongue, and who had spoken it before her, and why had a small order of nuns in a forgotten valley been entrusted, across centuries, with the keeping of its fragments? What was the river of light? Who were the tall people who were waiting? And the question Sister Teresa herself asked, on her deathbed, into the silence of her own confession, the question she wrote down in the last lines of her journal, in a hand that had begun to tremble, the question that has only recently begun to be asked aloud again. If the child was remembering rather than learning, then who taught her the first time, and where, and how long ago? And why was that knowledge taken from a world that now contains only its faint and grieving echoes? Tonight we read what the sister wrote. Tonight we walked through the convent with her. Tonight we met the giant child. And the question remains where she left it, in the dark, waiting, like the tall ones in the journal, for someone willing to remember.